The square was loud and restless, filled with footsteps, voices, and the sound of life moving too fast. People hurried past food stalls and small shops, eyes fixed on their phones or the ground ahead. In one quiet corner stood an old public piano, its paint chipped, keys slightly yellow with age. Most people treated it like furniture, something always there but never noticed. A young girl stood a few steps away from the piano, holding a small cloth bag close to her chest. Her clothes were clean but worn, the kind that had been washed many times until the color almost faded. She watched the piano for a long moment, as if listening to something only she could hear. Her shoulders were slightly tense, but her eyes were calm. She stepped forward slowly and looked around at the nearby people. Her voice was soft but clear when she spoke. She asked if she could play the piano in exchange for food. The words were simple, almost shy but honest. For a second, no one responded. Then a few people glanced at her and smirked. One man let out a short laugh and shook his head. Another whispered something to a friend, and both smiled. Someone muttered that the piano was not a toy. A woman passing by sighed and kept walking. No one sounded angry, but no one sounded kind either. To them, she was just another poor child asking for something. The girl did not argue. She did not explain herself. She simply nodded, as if she expected this reaction. She walked toward the piano and sat down carefully on the bench. The bench made a small creaking sound under her weight. A few people watched with mild interest, expecting noise, mistakes, maybe a quick embarrassment. She placed her hands on her lap first and closed her eyes for a brief moment. It looked like a habit, something she had done many times before. The noise of the square continued around her. Someone nearby dropped coins into a cup. A bus horn sounded in the distance. Life did not pause for her. When she finally lifted her hands and placed her fingers on the keys, they rested there gently. She did not rush. She did not test the keys or press them randomly. It was as if she already knew exactly where each note was. A few people nearby leaned in slightly, still smiling. One person raised a phone, not to record, but almost as a joke. Another whispered, saying this should be interesting. Their tone suggested they expected something clumsy. The girl took a slow breath. Her back straightened. Her fingers moved. The first note was soft, almost quiet enough to disappear into the noise of the square. But it did not disappear. Carried a steady tone, clean and sure. Then came the second note and the third, forming a simple melody. Not loud, not fast, just clear. Some people kept walking unaware, but a few slowed down. One man stopped mid-step. A woman holding a paper bag turned her head slightly. The sound coming from the piano did not match what they expected. The girl continued playing, her hands moving smoothly. Her fingers did not hesitate. Each note followed the next like a calm conversation. The melody grew richer, filling the small space around the piano. It was not a showy tune. It was thoughtful, full of feeling. The laughter stopped. A small group of people now stood nearby, watching without speaking. Someone lowered their phone, suddenly unsure. The girl's face remained peaceful, her eyes focused on the keys. She looked completely at home, as if the noisy square had faded away and only the piano remained. The music carried something deeper than sound. It felt like memory, like longing, like hope quietly holding on. Even those who did not understand music could feel it. The notes were steady, confident, and full of control. A man who had laughed earlier crossed his arms and listened. His expression changed, confusion replacing humor. A woman who had ignored the girl before now stood still, her food forgotten in her hand. The piano no longer sounded old. It sounded alive. The girl played on, unaware of the growing attention, or perhaps aware but unbothered. Her movements were natural, shaped by long practice. Her fingers curved perfectly. Her wrists relaxed. This was not something learned in a week or a month. This was the result of years. People began to wonder who she was. Some whispered questions. Where did she learn to play like that? How could someone so young sound so skilled? No one had answers. The square felt different now. The usual noise softened, replaced by listening. Even the wind seemed to slow. The girl shifted slightly on the bench and moved into another part of the piece. The melody deepened, becoming more emotional. It told a story without words. A child sitting on the ground nearby stared openly, eyes wide. An older man nodded slowly in time with the rhythm. Someone near the back closed their eyes. The music connected them all, even though they were strangers. The girl's expression changed slightly as she played. Not a smile, but a quiet focus, like she was remembering something important. Her shoulders relaxed further. For these moments, she was not asking for food. She was giving something. A few people reached into their pockets, not yet stepping forward, unsure if they should interrupt. Others simply stood and listened, feeling something they could not name. The piano keys moved under her fingers, worn but obedient. The piece was not finished yet. It was only the beginning. The girl's hands slowed, preparing for the next part, her breath steady. The square waited even if it did not realize it was waiting. And just like that, what began as a quiet request had turned into something no one expected. The girl who was laughed at moments ago now held the attention of everyone nearby, without asking for it. She continued to play, unaware that this moment would change everything that followed. As the first notes settled in the air, the young girl's music began to catch the attention of more people. A man carrying groceries paused mid-step, the bags weighing down his arms, and tilted his head slightly toward the piano. He frowned at first, unsure why he had stopped, but as the melody continued, a slow smile crept across his face. The tune was simple yet precise, and it had a way of making the noisy square feel smaller, more focused. People started to slow down as they walked, drawn by something they could not explain. A woman sitting on a nearby bench put down her phone and leaned forward. She had been scrolling absent-mindedly, but now her eyes were fixed on the girl. Her brow, initially furrowed in impatience, relaxed as she realized this was not ordinary music. It was careful, full of feeling, and each note seemed to carry a story. The music was soft, yet it filled the space around the piano, touching the edges of the crowd like ripples in water. The girl's hands moved gently but confidently over the keys. Each finger seemed to know exactly where to go, pressing down in a way that made the notes sing. Her movements were deliberate and graceful, a reflection of training that could not be learned overnight. The people watching could sense that this was more than just talent, it was passion. Her eyes remained mostly closed, her expression calm, as if she were speaking directly to the piano rather than anyone in the crowd. A small child, no older than 7, walked closer, holding a small toy in one hand. The child's mother tried to pull them away, but the child resisted, stepping forward to watch. The music held a strange magic, the kind that makes even the restless stop and listen. The mother, realizing the child's fascination, let them stay, watching from a distance. The melody was gentle enough to be inviting, yet powerful enough to demand attention. Some people whispered to each other, trying to explain what they were hearing. "She's really good," one man said quietly. "How old do you think she is?" Another shook their head. "I've never seen someone play like that before. Not here, not anywhere." Even those who did not know much about music felt the effect. The piano, once a background object, now seemed to have a voice of its own, telling a story without words. The girl shifted slightly on the bench and her hands moved into a more complex part of the piece. The melody gained depth, growing more emotional. It was no longer just notes. It was feeling. Some of the people who had been skeptical moments ago began to nod slightly in appreciation. The man with the groceries lowered his head, letting his fingers graze the handle of his bag as he lost himself in the music. The woman on the bench closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. Even the noise of the square seemed to fade around her. Car horns were distant. Footsteps were softer. It was as if the piano had created a little bubble of calm. The crowd, previously scattered and impatient, began to form an invisible circle, everyone facing toward the music. Strangers exchanged glances, surprised by their own attention. Some laughed quietly at themselves, realizing they had paused for a child playing an old piano on the street. The girl's expression changed subtly as she played. Her lips pressed together, her eyes closed a little tighter. It was not a smile or a frown, just a quiet intensity that came from complete focus. The people watching could feel it, a seriousness that made the music more than a simple performance. It was a reflection of her life, a story being told through her fingers. A man who had initially mocked her, laughing softly at her request, now stopped. His smile faded, replaced by a look of surprise and curiosity. He leaned on a nearby lamppost, unsure if he should stay or leave, and just listened. The transformation from laughter to attention was subtle but undeniable. Others who had passed by without a second glance now found themselves rooted to the spot. The girl moved into another part of the song, one that required more skill and precision. Her fingers danced lightly over the keys, but there was no haste. Every note had a purpose. The complexity was clear, but it was never showy. She did not play for attention. She played because the music was a part of her. People began to murmur softly among themselves, recognizing the level of talent they were witnessing. "It's incredible," one whispered. "She could be a professional." Some in the crowd began to offer small gestures of support. A few coins were dropped into the small cloth bag she had set beside the piano. The girl barely glanced at them, her focus remaining on the music. She did not play for the coins, but the crowd seemed to want to give them as a way of acknowledging what they were seeing. Each note she played became more assured, more powerful, yet still gentle and precise. The woman on the bench opened her eyes and looked around, noticing that the crowd had grown without anyone realizing it. People were stopping mid-step, adjusting bags, leaning on railings, all captivated by something they had assumed would be simple street noise. A man carrying a briefcase lowered it and stared, unsure why he had paused, but unable to move on. The piano had created a shared moment of wonder. The girl's hands moved in a rhythm that felt natural and free, yet perfectly controlled. Each chord blended seamlessly into the next, creating a wave of sound that reached every corner of the square. It was more than technique. It was emotion, skill, and understanding combined. Even those unfamiliar with music felt a connection, as though the melody was speaking directly to them. A teenager nearby put their headphones down, forgetting entirely about the music they had been listening to. They leaned closer, eyes wide, caught in the unexpected beauty of the moment. The crowd's energy shifted. Laughter and chatter had almost disappeared, replaced by an attentive hush. Even the birds perched on nearby trees seemed to quiet, as if listening. The girl did not rush to finish the piece. She let each section breathe, letting the sound linger between notes. The silence around her became part of the performance, allowing the music to settle in the hearts of those who were listening. Every pause was intentional, every movement measured, and every note told a story. A small group of people, previously skeptical, began to exchange whispered comments. "She must have trained for years," one said. "There's no way she learned that on the street." Another nodded, feeling a mix of admiration and awe. They were realizing that talent often hides in plain sight, unnoticed until a moment like this reveals it. The girl's focus never wavered. She seemed to exist entirely in the music, unaware of the growing crowd or the changing expressions on the faces around her. Her body moved with a quiet grace, hands gliding over the keys effortlessly. The melody rose and fell, carrying the listeners along on a journey they could not see but could feel deeply. As the piece continued, the energy in the square transformed. People who had been impatient or distracted now felt a sense of calm and connection. Strangers exchanged small smiles, acknowledging the shared experience without words. The girl's music had changed the square from a place of rush and noise to a place of attention and wonder. The coins in the bag clinked softly as the crowd contributed what they could, but the girl did not pause for them. She played as if nothing else mattered, as if the piano and the music were all that existed in that moment. The attention and support were felt, but they were secondary. The music was primary, and it carried a weight that spoke louder than any words. By the time the girl reached the final section she had planned for now, the crowd was fully engaged. People stopped completely, leaning on railings, benches, and each other, all facing toward the piano. The initial smirks and laughter had vanished, replaced by quiet amazement. The girl's hands moved with fluid precision, wrapping the melody around the listeners, holding their attention without force. The music began to slow, transitioning into a gentle ending. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a final moment before pressing the last note. Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was full of presence, as though the square itself was listening. The moment hung, delicate and complete, before soft applause began to rise from the small crowd. Some clapped quietly, others more audibly. A few whispered words of praise, still unsure of what had just happened. The young girl opened her eyes slowly, glanced at the crowd, and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. She did not speak, but her eyes held gratitude. The music had spoken for her, and it had been heard. The square slowly returned to its usual pace, but the memory of the music lingered. People moved on with their lives, but they carried a sense of having witnessed something rare and beautiful. The girl, meanwhile, sat quietly, her hands resting on the keys. She had not asked for admiration, but she had earned it in the purest way possible, through talent, patience, and honesty. After the applause had settled, the crowd lingered, some hesitant to leave, others quietly talking about what they had just witnessed. The young girl remained at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys. She took a slow, steady breath, and for a moment, she allowed herself to look at the people around her. Their expressions had changed from doubt and amusement to curiosity and admiration. It was a subtle shift, but it made her feel lighter, as if the weight of earlier judgment had lifted. A man who had stopped to listen earlier approached her cautiously. He was not sure if he should speak, but curiosity got the better of him. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked softly. The girl looked up, her eyes calm and clear, but she did not answer immediately. Instead, she returned her gaze to the piano, as if gathering her thoughts. She had played in front of strangers before, but not like this, never in a place where people initially mocked her and then watched with such intensity. She began to tell a quiet story with her words, not through a long speech, but in small, measured sentences. She had learned music as a child, in a small home where every day was filled with sound. Her family had not been wealthy, but there had been a piano, old and worn, and a teacher who saw potential in her fingers before she even fully understood what she could do. She practiced for hours every day, losing herself in the notes, finding comfort in the way music could make even the hardest days lighter. Life had not been easy. There had been illness in the family, financial struggles, and responsibilities too heavy for someone her age. Opportunities to perform on real stages had vanished as survival became the focus. She had learned to play in secret sometimes, or in small moments when she could escape to the piano. She had continued to play not for recognition, but because it was the only way she could speak when words felt impossible. The people around her listened intently, sensing the depth behind her calm demeanor. They could see that the laughter and mockery had been misplaced. The girl was not simply talented. She had endured hardship and had kept her gift alive despite it all. Her music now was a reflection of her life, carrying every quiet struggle, every small triumph, every moment of hope she had clung to. A woman who had been watching from a distance stepped closer. "It's incredible," she said, her voice low. "I never would have guessed someone so young could play like that, and with so much feeling." The girl smiled faintly, a small curve of her lips, and nodded in acknowledgement. She did not boast, nor did she need to. Her music had already spoken louder than words ever could. The girl's story unfolded further as she continued to play. Each melody carried hints of her past, soft notes that spoke of childhood innocence, sharper chords that hinted at challenges and loss, and flowing sequences that reflected moments of hope and perseverance. Those listening began to understand that what they had heard was not just a performance, but a life expressed in sound. People began to ask questions, not out of pity, but genuine interest. How had she managed to practice with so many responsibilities? How had she preserved her skill despite the hardships? Her answers were simple but heartfelt. She explained that music had been her anchor. When everything around her seemed uncertain or difficult, playing piano made her feel steady. It gave her a sense of purpose and a way to express what she could not say in words. Each practice session had been a small victory. Each piece she learned a triumph over the circumstances that tried to limit her. A young boy in the crowd, who had been inspired by her performance, asked if he could try playing as well. The girl encouraged him gently, guiding his hands on the keys. It was a quiet lesson, not formal or long, but the boy's eyes lit up as he made the first notes. The crowd watched this small interaction, feeling the ripple of the girl's generosity and understanding. She had been underestimated, yet she offered guidance without judgment or arrogance. A man who had initially mocked her spoke quietly to the person next to him, shaking his head in disbelief. He realized that his laughter had been premature and ill-placed. He had assumed poverty meant lack of talent or skill, but here was a child who had more mastery than he had ever imagined. His expression softened, and there was a trace of humility in the way he looked at the girl. The girl continued to play, moving from one part of her story to another. Her fingers glided over the keys, creating layers of sound that carried her experiences, her dreams, and her quiet resilience. People started to recognize her as more than a street performer. She was an artist, a storyteller, someone who had lived through struggles and found a way to turn them into beauty. The crowd slowly grew silent, not from fear or instruction, but from the power of the moment. Every note was a bridge between her world and theirs, connecting strangers through emotion and understanding. It was a rare kind of connection that needed no words, just the honesty of sound and experience. Some people closed their eyes, letting the music speak directly to them. Others leaned forward, hanging on each note as if it held a secret meant only for them. A passerby who had originally laughed at her request for food now approached, offering a small gesture of support. She thanked them quietly with a nod, but her attention remained on the piano. It was not the gesture that mattered. It was the recognition that her skill and perseverance had been seen and appreciated. Each coin, each word of admiration, was secondary to the true acknowledgement she had earned through her talent and courage. The girl's music became a living narrative, each note a sentence, each melody a paragraph. People who had ignored her before now found themselves moved, reflecting on the story behind the hands on the keys. It was a reminder that appearances could be misleading, and that every person has depths waiting to be discovered if one takes the time to look. Some members of the crowd began to share her story quietly among themselves. They realized that they had been given a rare glimpse into a hidden world, a talent nurtured against odds and revealed in a simple, humble request. They spoke not of charity, but of respect, admiration, and a newfound understanding of resilience. The girl's story, told through music, continued to unfold. She moved into parts of the piece that required both skill and emotion, weaving her past and present together. Each chord carried weight, each pause spoke volumes, and each melody left a quiet impression. It was an immersive experience, and those who listened felt the impact long after the notes had ended. By the time the girl reached the final moments of her current piece, the square had transformed in subtle ways. People were calmer, more reflective, and more aware of the beauty that could exist even in unexpected places. She had not only played the piano, she had shared a piece of her life, a narrative that resonated without words. The power of her story lay in its simplicity, its honesty, and its emotional truth. When the last note faded, a respectful silence followed. The crowd did not immediately clap, not out of hesitation, but out of a shared sense of reverence. They had witnessed something rare. A young girl who had faced hardships yet nurtured her gift, who had asked only for a chance to play, and who had reminded everyone present of the value of talent, perseverance, and quiet dignity. The girl remained seated, her hands lightly resting on the keys, her eyes calm and observant. She had shared her hidden past, and in doing so, had created a moment that would linger in the hearts of those who had listened as the young girl rested her hands on the piano. The quiet respect from the crowd grew. People who had laughed or ignored her before now looked at her with admiration. Their expressions had changed in subtle ways. The man with groceries had straightened his posture, The woman on the bench leaned forward with interest, and even the passerby who had mocked her seemed thoughtful, almost embarrassed by his initial reaction. A few coins lay in the small cloth bag at her side. The girl did not glance at them immediately. She had played not for money but because music was part of her, and now she allowed herself a quiet nod of appreciation for the gestures. Each coin, each small act of acknowledgement, was more than charity. It was recognition, a way for people to show respect for her talent and effort. Her gaze swept over the crowd, and she could see that many had been moved, even if they did not know exactly why. A man stepped forward tentatively. He had been standing at the edge of the crowd, unsure whether to approach or remain distant. Now he held a small piece of paper, folded carefully. He spoke softly, almost apologetically. I should not have laughed earlier. I thought you were just asking for help, but now I realize I misjudged you. The girl gave a small smile and a nod, accepting his words without a need for verbal acknowledgement. She understood humility and grace, and she did not need to dwell on past mistakes. Her music had already conveyed her story, and that was enough. Others joined in, offering bits of food, water, and encouraging words. A few even asked if she wanted a proper meal, which she accepted with gratitude, not as pity, but as a gesture of goodwill. The square had transformed. What had started as a mocking scene now carried an air of quiet admiration. People moved closer, giving her space yet showing interest. They wanted to be near her, to feel the presence of someone extraordinary performing in such a simple setting. A young boy who had been observing the entire time held a small notebook and pencil. He timidly stepped forward and said, I want to learn to play like that someday. The girl glanced at him, her eyes soft, and guided his hands on the piano for a few notes. The child's eyes widened as he pressed the keys, the sound producing a mix of delight and surprise. The crowd watched quietly, understanding that this small moment of teaching was as important as the music itself. The girl had become a bridge, not only for music but for hope and inspiration. The people who had doubted her now whispered among themselves. She's amazing, one said softly. I can't believe I laughed at her. Another nodded, still absorbing the display of talent and humility. There was a sense of shared realization that appearances can be deceiving, and that true skill often goes unnoticed until given a chance to shine. Their earlier behavior faded into quiet self-reflection, replaced by respect. The girl's music began to flow again, softer this time, more reflective. It was a gentle melody, not meant to dazzle but to connect. People stopped all movement, some sitting on nearby steps, others simply standing, letting the sound wash over them. The square was no longer just a place of movement and noise. It had become a place of attention, care, and understanding. The music created a quiet space where the daily rush of life softened and the humanity of everyone present became clearer. A woman who had been passing by with her groceries returned, quietly placing a small sandwich and a bottle of water beside the girl. I thought you might need this, she said softly. The girl smiled faintly and nodded, appreciating the kindness. It was not just sustenance. It was a recognition of her presence, of her worth, and of the gift she had shared without asking for anything in return. The moment carried warmth and sincerity, and the woman walked away, feeling quietly satisfied that she had helped. The crowd continued to engage in small acts of respect. Some offered a few coins, others simply stayed to listen. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by a collective sense of being part of something special. People who had passed by before lingered, drawn by the quiet transformation of the space. Everyone seemed to understand, even without words, that this young girl had turned a simple act, playing piano for food, into an experience that revealed patience, skill, and the depth of human resilience. The girl's music became more expressive, revealing layers of emotion. Sorrow from hardships, hope from perseverance, and quiet joy from moments of unexpected kindness. Each note carried the weight of her life, yet was light enough to touch those listening without overwhelming them. People began to recognize the extraordinary effort behind every sound. It was not simply talent. It was a combination of experience, dedication, and a refusal to let circumstances define her ability to create beauty. The initial skeptics now found themselves humbled. A man who had leaned on a lamppost in amusement moments earlier now stood quietly, hand on his chin, fully engaged. He had come expecting entertainment or perhaps comedy, but he had found authenticity and skill. The change in his demeanor reflected the larger transformation in the crowd. A shift from judgment to appreciation, from mockery to genuine respect. The girl noticed the reactions but did not let them distract her. Her focus remained on the piano, on the sound, and on conveying her story through music. She understood that the audience's perception would shift naturally as they listened, as they opened themselves to the moment. She played with precision and grace, each chord deliberate, each pause intentional. Her hands moved over the keys effortlessly, expressing the depth of her experience in a way words could never capture. Some people began to offer encouragement verbally, softly saying things like, "Beautiful," "Amazing," or "Thank you for sharing." The girl acknowledged them with small nods or gentle smiles, never breaking the flow of her music. She understood that her art was both a personal expression and a gift to those willing to listen. The applause that had erupted earlier had faded into a quiet, consistent admiration, a shared acknowledgement of her presence and talent. A young woman stepped forward, her expression reflective. She spoke quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. "I never imagined someone could hold so much in their music." The girl simply nodded, allowing the statement to pass without comment. Her music had already communicated more than any words could. Her actions were subtle but powerful, demonstrating humility, focus, and an unwavering commitment to her craft. The coins and food continued to accumulate at her side, not as a primary focus but as a reminder that the people had shifted from ridicule to recognition. The act of giving had become a way for the audience to participate in acknowledging the girl's skill and resilience. It was no longer about charity. It was about respect and appreciation. Those watching began to understand that talent could thrive even in difficult circumstances, and that humility could amplify the impact of skill. The girl's performance moved toward a gentle conclusion. She slowed the pace of her playing, letting each note linger, giving the audience time to absorb the depth of what they had experienced. The square, once noisy and chaotic, had become calm and attentive, filled with a quiet energy that reflected the transformation in the people present. Every individual had been touched in some way, whether through the music itself or through the example of the girl's composure and dedication. When the final note faded, a hush settled over the crowd. It was not awkward silence but a moment of collective reflection. People exchanged glances, understanding that they had witnessed something rare and meaningful. The young girl remained seated at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys. She looked out at the audience and offered a small, graceful smile, acknowledging their presence and appreciation without a word. The applause began slowly, then grew as people expressed their admiration in a genuine, heartfelt way. It was not loud or forceful. It was steady, thoughtful, and sincere. Some individuals clapped while others nodded or whispered quiet words of praise. The girl's eyes met those of a few people in the crowd, sharing acknowledgement without ego. She had played for herself and for the music, but now she had given the audience something far greater. A glimpse into her world and the reminder that talent, perseverance, and humility can command respect even in unexpected circumstances. By the end of the applause, the square had changed in subtle ways. The atmosphere was lighter, more reflective, and filled with a sense of shared humanity. People who had once mocked or ignored her now understood the value of her skill and the depth of her character. The young girl had transformed a simple performance into a meaningful encounter, teaching lessons about respect, admiration, and the importance of recognizing talent and perseverance wherever it appears. As the crowd began to disperse, many lingered a few steps behind, reluctant to leave the moment behind. They had been touched by the music, the story, and the humility of someone who had endured challenges, yet chose to share her gift freely. The young girl remained at the piano, watching quietly as the people around her absorbed the experience. She had not demanded attention, but she had earned it in the most genuine way possible, leaving a lasting impression on everyone who had paused to listen. After the applause had faded and the crowd began to thin, a quiet stillness lingered in the square. The young girl remained at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys, her eyes scanning the faces of those who had stayed behind. Some were still quietly murmuring among themselves, reflecting on what they had witnessed. Others simply stood in silence, feeling the lingering presence of the music and the humility of the performer. The square felt different now, filled with a sense of shared respect and a subtle understanding of the talent and perseverance that had been displayed. A man approached, careful not to startle her. He was dressed in a formal coat and carried a small notebook. He had been observing from a distance, initially drawn by curiosity but now moved to action by admiration. "Excuse me," he said softly. "I am part of a music organization. We often look for talented young performers for events and opportunities. I couldn't help but notice your skill. Would you consider sharing your music on a larger stage?" The girl looked at him with calm curiosity. She had never expected this. Her life had been full of quiet practice, private performances, and small moments of acknowledgement, but never attention of this kind. She listened carefully as the man explained his intentions, assuring her that this was not charity but recognition of her ability. He wanted to provide an opportunity to perform where her talent could be seen and appreciated by more people. Her initial response was thoughtful. She had grown used to playing in places where people only glanced briefly, where the piano was old, and the audience often dismissive. Now she was being offered something different, a chance to be recognized for what she had worked for all her life. She considered the possibilities. A stage, an audience who would listen without judgment, the chance to continue her music in a way she had only dreamed of. It was overwhelming, yet also hopeful. The crowd that remained watched the interaction quietly. They had already seen her transform their perception with her music. Now they watched her consider a real opportunity that could change her life. Some whispered words of encouragement. "You should do it," a woman said softly. "Your talent deserves to be seen." A man nodded. "Don't let this chance pass. You've earned it." The girl finally nodded, a quiet decision that carried more weight than any words. She would accept the opportunity, not out of pride or ambition, but because it felt like the natural next step after years of quiet dedication. Music had been her anchor through hardships, and now it could open doors she had never imagined. The recognition was not for herself alone, but for the value of the art she had nurtured through adversity. As the man gave her some information and offered to arrange the first meeting, the crowd began to disperse slowly. People left with smiles, quiet reflections, and a sense of having witnessed something rare. Those who had mocked or doubted her earlier now carried a small humility, a recognition that talent can thrive even in unexpected places. Their actions, once dismissive, had been replaced by admiration and respect. The girl took a moment to absorb everything. She looked around at the piano, at the coins, food, and small gestures of kindness left by strangers, and realized how far she had come. Each small performance, each day of practice, each quiet moment of resilience had led to this point. The piano, once a simple tool for expression, had become a bridge between her world and that of others. It had transformed laughter into respect and curiosity into recognition. A child who had been inspired by her earlier approached again. The girl smiled softly and gestured for the child to play a few notes. She guided the small hands gently, teaching in quiet, deliberate movements. The child's joy and excitement were evident, and the audience, now smaller but attentive, watched with warmth. It was a continuation of the lessons she had always shared through music: patience, practice, and the quiet power of persistence. People who had lingered also began sharing small words of encouragement, some offering contact information, others sharing ways to help her find further opportunities. The girl received each with a calm acknowledgement. She understood that help and opportunity could come in many forms, but the core remained her music, her skill, and her dedication. She had played not for attention, yet her honesty and perseverance had drawn it naturally. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the square, the girl played one last gentle piece for those who remained. The melody was soft, reflective, filled with gratitude, hope, and quiet joy. People listened intently, feeling the narrative behind each note. The music was not meant to impress but to connect, to share a piece of her life and to honor those who had chosen to listen. When the final note lingered and slowly faded into the evening air, the crowd offered a final round of applause, steady and sincere. Some wiped tears from their eyes, others smiled in quiet satisfaction, feeling as if they had witnessed something truly meaningful. The young girl nodded in acknowledgement, feeling the warmth of the moment, but remained humble. She understood that recognition was fleeting, but the impact of her music, the lessons shared, and the opportunities opened were lasting. She packed her small bag and looked at the piano one last time. It had been a witness to her talent, her struggles, and now her acknowledgement by others. She placed her hands on the keys gently, almost as a gesture of farewell, and then rose to leave. The square, once noisy and chaotic, felt lighter, transformed not only by her music, but by the lessons shared with those who had witnessed her story. The man from the music organization approached one last time, offering a reassuring smile and a promise to arrange the next steps. She accepted quietly, a sense of calm determination in her movements. The day had begun with a simple request, met with laughter and doubt, but it had ended with respect, acknowledgement, and hope for the future. As she walked away from the piano, the coins, the food, and the quiet crowd, she carried more than just the possibility of opportunity. She carried the knowledge that talent, humility, and perseverance could transform moments, change perceptions, and open doors. Every small effort, every note played with honesty and heart, could ripple into something greater. People in the square watched her leave, some reflecting silently, others discussing what they had just experienced. They understood that the story of a young girl asking to play for food had become a story of transformation, not just for her, but for everyone who had stopped to listen. It was a reminder that true talent, paired with perseverance and humility, could never go unnoticed for long. As the girl disappeared from view, the square slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Yet something had shifted. The people who remained carried the quiet memory of her music, the story of resilience and skill, and the lesson that even the smallest request, met with doubt, could reveal greatness when approached with honesty and heart. Her journey, though far from over, had begun a new chapter, filled with promise, recognition, and the quiet power of her extraordinary talent.